Good evening. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek, and coming to you from my hermitage in Lynchburg. And today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what I call the isms of historians. These words that end in ISM that historians frequently use, and with good reasons. And I'd like to discuss when it's an appropriate time to generate an ism and how isms should be generated, and mistakenly by the postmodernist revisionist historians today, how they are generated by them. And explain a lot of this with reference to works on Thomas Jefferson. You got to get up again. Every time he knows I'm going on camera, he hears me talk. He's got to be up here. Okay, Jeff. All right. We have isms. We've seen, in some of my works, you'll see someone reference to colonialism, stadialism, imperialism, liberalism, and so forth. These are sorts of illustrations of the isms. You want to come up here? Go. And start out with something that psychologist and philosopher William James, the great pragmatist, once said. He said, when a child comes into the world, he experiences the world around him as a blooming, buzzing confusion. And it goes without saying, as the infant matures and interacts with objects, he comes to differentiate objects by grouping them into different kinds. And of course, he's aided by that by adults who help him. And in some cases, a box is not the same thing as a penguin. An infant very early on learns to differentiate, between, say, living and non-living. And later on, things like a penguin and a puffin. Well, a puffin looks a lot like a penguin, but it's smaller and it doesn't fly. Okay. Now, the problem is that the isms that historians utilize are much unlike puffins and penguins. They're slippery, unwieldy, and they oftentimes answer more to the psychological eccentricities of historians than they do to reality. Now, why is that the case? I'm telling you nothing new here when I say an historian's subject is the past, and no historian can have direct access to that past. So that already is a bit of a problem. We're dealing with a sort of refractory or distant subject matter. So what a historian does is he gathers relevant data that's available, texts and artifacts, whatever, DNA and things like that. And tries to construct create a coherent story to uh, talk about a particularly important historical person like Thomas Jefferson, or an event like the American Revolution, which of course is a very large issue. Try to create a coherent story that is answerable to the facts. I'm one of those dinosaurs that thinks there are certain facts here around which a historian crafts a narrative, right? Now, it goes without saying that historians tend to write about things that interest them. So the motivation for a particular book or paper will not necessarily be disinterest. So there's going to be interest. So historians come to their subject with interest, not disinterest. So they have, in some sense, that's a little bit of a bias, but it's not a particularly harmful bias. Um, as long as once you pick a particular topic, that you approach the subject matter thereafter with disinterest. I give you a couple examples. I talked of one not long ago, Jack McLaughlin's Jefferson and Monticello biography of a builder. McLaughlin does a lot of things right here. He picks out a subject that has heretofore never been attempted. You know, Jefferson, a biography of Jefferson as a builder, not an architect. He narrows the topic even further by restricting his subject matter to Monticello instead of talking about all the projects with which Jefferson was involved. And lastly, he covers his account or his narrative with a thoroughness, with an attention to minutiae that is beyond the ken of lazier scholars. Yes, and there are very lazy scholars. In contrast, we can look at Pete Onuf's The Mind of Thomas Jefferson. I've talked of this before. Onuf, the title itself promises insight, tremendous insight into who Thomas Jefferson was. When we read these sort of loosely connected chapters, and I say loosely connected chapters because there's no thesis threaded to this book is just a collection of essays that some of which seem to be related to others and some don't, that are thrown together in a book and get published by University of Virginia Press. Um, no surprises, Onuf is one of the editors of Jeffersonian America there, and so what we learn that's about the mind of Jefferson is that Jefferson was an epistolary chameleon. He wrote to subjects in ways that interested them in such a way that if you really want to read from his letters and try to glean a picture of the true Thomas Jefferson, that project is doomed to failure. So what we get is we can construct possible Jeffersons, right? A possible Jefferson is an account of Jefferson that is guided by one criterion, namely consistency. As long as I have a consistent picture, I would add, though, that Onuf, because of his unabashed detestation of Thomas Jefferson, would add that he's going to rule out any account that makes Jefferson out to be an estimable figure. He's got to be a detestable figure. And as I said, I don't choose the word, particularly eschew the term narrative for Onuf because the book is not a narrative in any sense of the word. Okay. But an ism is not a narrative. McLaughlin's book is a narrative. He's covering the life of Jefferson uh, through the eyes of Jefferson as a builder. But a narrative is not an ism. An ism is something larger. An ism is something like a meta-narrative. It is a narrative, as I would say, that glues together narratives of historians on a particular topic. The Enlightenment, for example, talks about all sorts of people and events that happened within a particular period of time. And the Enlightenment is the term that historians have come up over time to sort of describe the literature and the intellectual climate that occurred at that particular time in which Jefferson lived. Okay, now some narratives, isms are useful fictions and narratives are in some sense, I think, useful fictions, but that doesn't really mean that some narratives are not truer than others. Now I use truer, obviously I misuse truer because statements true or narrative's truth or falsity is not a matter of degrees, but in some sense a narrative can be truer insofar as it's a closer approximation to the reality. It's a closer approximation to the reality of, say, Jefferson's life, if it's a biography of Jefferson. If we take in consideration Dumas Malone's 6-volume biography of Thomas Jefferson, on which he worked for 4 decades, this is a very formidable work in some sense, and does a very, very good job. I don't think anybody could attempt a biography of Jefferson without consulting Malone's work. I still find it a treasure trove of information on topics that other scholars miss. Okay, so, well, when historians do their job well, in the case of Malone's work, right, the facts themselves will be suggestive of a sort of glue, the narrative needed to bind them. When the facts are few, or when historians do a poor job of what they're supposed to do, as in the case of Pete Onuf's The Mind of Jefferson, there will be an indescribably large number of narratives that are consistent with the facts, right? So the idea is we don't want to have a scenario in which there are a large number of narratives, and that's the job of historians to gather more facts so that we can sort of decrease the number of possible or interesting narratives that one can construct on an event. Now, I want to talk about history from below and history from above. I say when historians approach their discipline with integrity, with guilelessness, the narratives themselves, say the narratives in the life of Thomas Jefferson, that will themselves allow certain isms and disallow other isms. They will allow some meta narratives and disallow other narratives. This is in effect is called realist history, the sort of history I practice, von Rankian history, Thucydidean history. When historians, on the other hand, I think Onuf's a great example, politicize their history, they begin with certain isms, qua narratives, and they frame their narratives in pursuance of that particular ism. That's, in effect, history from above. I begin with the ism, and then I write the biography or whatever I'm doing. I kind of talk about the event, like the American Revolution, from the perspective of that ism. I take in a topic from above, whereas history as it should be practiced, or as it ought to be practiced, as I insist, is von Rankian, in effect, that it's from below, it's fact guided, and the gathering of facts and data themselves will suggest certain narratives and rule out others. Now let's consider the ism very popular today, I goes without saying, racism in American history. Now, this is a covering term brought into play from above, right? And it is, without question, an explanatorily rich concept, right? And that's exactly, it's used to explain all sorts of things in American culture. And that's exactly the problem with the concept, with the ism, racism. It explains much too much. In effect, when we find out something explains much too much, it's likely that it's very, very problematic. Um, Go back to Karl Popper, philosopher Karl Popper, the great German philosopher, talking about how Freud's theory seems to offer an explanation. Adlerian in individual psychology seems to be able to explain everything, as well as Marxist theory. Any sort of impediment or possible difficulty for Marxism as an historical concept, a historical driving explanation, seems to be integrated within the theory and accommodated by the theory. And that's just what one of the problems is. Now, even though it's explanatorily rich, that is a watered down sense of richness, because I think it does very, very little ideological work. In other words, it doesn't do much causal work. So the explanation that we wind up being given is rather poor. Now let me look at two particular, here I need to read from my notes here. Joe Ellis, in an encyclopedia entry on Thomas Jefferson, Ellis writes, notes on Virginia contain the most explicit assessment that Jefferson ever wrote of what he believed were biological differences between blacks and whites, an assessment that exposed the deep-rooted racism that he, like most Americans and almost like all Virginians of his day, harbored throughout his life. Now, one comment is, if during Jefferson's time, if almost all Americans were racist, and almost all Virginians of his day were racist, and most Americans were racist. Going back to Jefferson's notes on Virginia, he says that the ratio whites to black in Virginia was 11 to 10. So if we're going to say almost all Virginians are racist, that clearly implies from what Ellis says that almost all blacks were racist as well. It certainly seems to be something that he doesn't, to which he doesn't want to commit, but that just follows from his view, whether he likes it or not. So, here we have, is racism, when just about everybody in the country at the time is a racist, just what sort of work is it really doing? Are we imposing something on what was going on back then that really wasn't happening? That's what we were doing, I suggest. So in what sense is that really explaining? Now let's look at Jake Silverstein. He's the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine. And he goes on this rant when he talks about publishing the 1619 thesis, right? And the gal who wrote that garbage won the Pulitzer, I believe. He says, out of slavery and the anti-black racism it required, grew everything, should be there grew everything, but a little slip on his part, grew everything, nearly everything that has truly made America exceptional. Its economic might, its industrial power, its electoral system, its diet and popular music, the inequities of its public health and education, its astonishing penchant for violence, its income inequality, The example it sets for the world is a land of freedom and equality, its slang, its legal system, and the endemic racial fears and hatred that continue to plague it to this day. The seeds of all that were planted long before our official birthday in 1776, when the men known as our founders formally declared independence from Britain. Now, let's look at Silverstein's sentiments and try to make some sense of him. Jeffrey, you're sitting there freezing, okay? It's not that cold outside. Now obviously, Silverstein glosses over, says nothing about Central and South America, both which received many more slaves than North America. He doesn't talk about England, which was shipping over the slaves by the boatloads, by the tens of thousands, both black and white. People don't seem to understand that there were a large number of white slaves in early American history. And these were sent over. The prisons were overcrowded in England, so they sent over prisoners just to get rid of them to colonize the New World. They sent over urchins on the street. They sent over prostitutes. They sent over, as I said, prisoners and all sorts of. They sent over Irish people and all sorts of undesirables. So to be sent on the earliest boats over to the New World, as many whites were, this was not necessarily a privilege. It was a matter of getting people, putting them in a dangerous situation. We know at the Jamestown settlement, for example, that of all the people sent early on, probably some 75%, if not more, lost their lives over time. And, of course, he says nothing about the black African princes who eagerly engaged in the practice of the slave trade, and they monetized handsomely, and their reputation grew as well by the practice. But these are things that, when you write things like the 1619 thesis, you can gloss over stuff. Now let's look at Silverstein's wording. Go back to what he says. He goes, out of slavery in the anti-black racism acquired, there grew. And then he goes on to say what grew. Now, is this a causal claim? Is it slavery, right, in the racism behind slavery was the cause of all the other things? Okay. Or not. Now, if it's not a causal claim, if it's merely a certain relaxed way of stating temporally that slavery was in North America very early on, and all the things that came to be defining features of America came after it. The slavery temporally preceded all these things. So, in effect, slavery, came before it. But if we want to suggest a causal link, then we are subject to the post hoc fallacy. After this, therefore, because of this, that one event happened after another, so the first must be the cause of the other. In many cases, that is like going to the grocery store where I stand on a certain mat. Once I stand on the mat, the door electronically opens. Now imagine I go on, I stand on the mat, and the second I stand on the mat, I say abracadabra. So I think, yes, my abracadabra caused the door to open, when of course it did not. It's my standing on the pad. Now, if it is a causal claim, and that seems to be the best way to understand the claim, then it is from the seed of slavery that all the evils, all the bad things, he mentions a couple things that might be construed as good, but all the bad things came from America. Okay, I want to break this argument up into, I want to show how all the threads of this argument fit together. So I make a 5 premise and 1 conclusion. So we have an argument with 6 claims. Claim 1, America is noted for its economic might, its industrial power, its electoral system, its diet, its popular music, its inequalities of its public health and education, its penchant for violence, its income inequality, its global example of freedom and equality, its slang, its legal system, and endemic racial fears and hatred. Premise 2, all such things define America. Premise 3, black slavery has been around America since 1619 and prior to the development of the things that have come to define America. Conclusion, so all such things that define America have been caused by slavery. Premise 5, slavery is essential to anti-Black racism. So 4 and 5 together we generate, so anti-Black racism has given rise to everything, or nearly everything, he qualifies it, that defines America. Now this is an astonishing argument um, that were given by Silverstein, right? Claim 1 is, that where he lists all the things that define America. What does he mean by, it's a very vague claim. America has its own slang, its legal system, its popular music, its inequities in public health care, its own penchant for violence. Of course, that's meant to be pejorative, its own income inequality. He's not quite clear just in what way that these things are unique to America. Are they unique to America? It seems like, that seems hard to believe. Or is it just a matter of a description of certain things that together sufficiently define America? I suspect the latter makes more sense, but even if that is the case, we still run the problem as have we been given an exhaustive list of all the things that define America? Now he says all such things define America, and that's the problem that I've discussed already. What does it mean? Are they jointly sufficient to give us a definition? As third premise, that Black slavery has been around since, right? So that's fine. It's been around since then. We grant that. That's true. Fourth, so all such things that define America have been caused by slavery. Now that seems to be the leap that he's taken. Slavery was the cause, right, of these things. Then we get to premise 5, right? This post hoc fallacy, of course. Slavery is essentially anti-Black racism. That claim is clearly false because slavery has been around for millennia, and all sorts of people, young women in the New World were forced to become prostitutes and so forth. In Arabic countries, white women were stolen. Even early Ukrainian people, the early Cossacks on raids, when they banded together with the Turks as one of the provisions of agreement to band together to form a treaty and attack, say, Poland or something, would be that a certain number of Ukrainian women or a certain number of women that were Polish or taken would come to the Turks and become slaves and part of a harem or some such thing. So slavery is not essentially uh, anti-Black racism because it's not just endemic to Black people. There were numbers and thousands of white slaves in early American history, and slavery continues unabated across the globe. Lastly, so anti-Black racism has given rise to everything that defines America. Now we have problems with the premises, so we have problems with the conclusion. I've stated that the argument is insultingly bad. That's exactly the argument we're given, right? To show just how stupid the argument is, let me slip in one term that slips in rather neatly: tobacco. For racism, we can call it tobaccoism, if you want to give it the ism thing. Okay, premise 1. America is noted for its economic might, industrial power, blah, 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 all the other things, slang, legal system, and its love, instead of its slavery, its love of growing tobacco, right? Okay, 2, all such things define America, same premise as we had before. 3, tobacco has been around America at least since 1612 at Jamestown, right? And prior to the development of all the things that define America. That's just a true claim. John Rolfe brought in a certain species of tobacco, and that became, Nicotiana tabacum in Latin. That became very, very popular due to its nicotine. And when he introduced the seeds, which took very well to the Virginian soil, they would grow tobacco and export tobacco or ship tobacco back to England. It became a very lucrative and it's business, and it saved Jamestown. Okay, so tobacco's been around since 1612, and prior to things that define it. So all things that define America have been caused by tobacco. that follows just as neatly as the racist claim. All things that define America has been caused by slavery. Premise 5, growing tobacco strips soil of key essential nutrients. That's very true. It's a very nutrient stripping uh, crop. Conclusion, so growing tobacco is essentially destruction of soil. Conclusion 7, so destruction of soil has given rise to everything or nearly everything that defines America. So we want to talk about destruction of the soil is causally responsible to everything it comes to define America. The tobacco growing was so prevalent at the time. It saved the Virginian settlement, saved Jamestown, right? Anybody who's going to be present with this tobacco argument is going to say this is just a unfucking believably ridiculous, silly argument, and that's true. It is. But the other argument is just unbelievably as fucking stupid too. And yet people don't recognize that someone wins a Pulitzer Prize, right, for constructing, at least implicitly, an argument such as this. And sorry if I don't mean to be nasty or pejorative. It's just a fucking stupid thesis. Okay, now the claims, to sum up, the claims of Ellis and Silverstein are illustrations of explanations that explain too much, explanations that come from above, right? Isms that come from above and drive history, right? Again, what are we going to say about a country where all persons are racist? Does that do any explaining? Um, how helpful is it to note that slavery was prior to the, all the things that define America? How can we go from that to say that it caused America? Uh, and the problem, again, is I want to talk about is the postmodernist or the revisionist comes in and uses the ism, right? It's that if we're going to write history today, it has to talk about slavery. And that really is what goes on when you write history today. And it's pathetically bad because the ism is seen to be a defining feature of American culture. At least we say that it is. We've made it so. We've shoved that down people's throat. You have to write about it, or if you don't, you're a racist. And because it's such an important concept, it's become an overarching ism that has to be weaved into the narratives. If you're going to write on Jefferson, you have to write about his racism, Washington, his racism, and so forth. All founding fathers who owned slaves or had anything negative to say about African Americans, right? When history is done the right way from the ground up, right? What we have is we have itself the facts generating our narratives. Okay, we get narratives of Thomas Jefferson based on examining the facts, that we use to create our narratives. Looking at the totality of the man, and when we work on our narratives from the ground up, the narratives can be revised by better narratives, which accommodate more facts or correct errors in prior narratives. And these narratives themselves say about the person who was Thomas Jefferson. The narratives themselves will suggest the isms or the isms or the meta narratives that arch over, people like the founding fathers. So that if anybody wants to write about the founding fathers, certain isms are important to talk about. Enlightenment is one such thing, one such ism, even though it doesn't have ISN M at the end of it. But that's the sort of way history should be done. That's the sort of it's the facts that drives the narratives, and the narratives that create for us our meta narratives. It's not the narratives themselves that force us to create the meta narratives, that like the isms like racism, that force us to create narratives that are all based on race, right? That's the way good history is not done. And to understand the sort of history that we get with Gordon Reed and Pete Onuff and Paul Finkelman and other people who focus on race, 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 race. That's all it is. Whoever owned slaves was a racist. This is a way of using contemporary language and stuff to try to understand past figures, not the way history needs to be done. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little talk on the isms of history and how isms from a, say, a von Rankian, Thucydidean, facts-based approach like my own differs from the isms or the meta-narratives that are employed by people like Peter Onuf, who work themselves from certain concepts, right, like racism that are believed to define us today, and we explain all the past history, right? I imagine Pete Onuf would explain Aristotle, would approach Aristotle's worldview, his Wen Chong, as well as all aspects of him by him being a racist because he didn't acknowledge the, uh, well, uh, he would have to, I guess, but that's just not the way we do history. All right, I hope you enjoyed this. We'll do it again another time. And take care. Good evening.